Okay, well, it's been a very, very, very long time since I have recorded anything for y'all. So I am recording a little piece here. This is just some reminders mainly, and also to kind of get you started on your practice for today. So let's talk a little bit. I just want to talk about this coordinate grid a little bit. Okay, and I'm going to go over two quick things, and then I'm going to get you started on your practice for today. So please bear with me. First off, let's remember that this horizontal axis is your x-axis, okay? So you can only go left or right. The vertical axis is your y, so it's up and down. So this is the x-axis and the y-axis, all right? We're going to talk a little bit about the quadrants. I don't know if you've ever been taught this trick, but if you draw a C on a 4-quadrant grid, you start your C in quadrant 1, then it goes to quadrant 2, then it goes to quadrant 3, and this is quadrant 4. And it's just an easy way to remember, so if you ever get asked a question about what would this be in quadrant 2, guess what? You've got a way to remember that, because it's kind of hard because it's backwards. We're used to always going right around, so it's backwards, okay? So draw that C for center, and you end up starting in the first quadrant and ending in the fourth quadrant. The other point I always want to start with is this point here that is called your origin, and I know you guys are doing really great. I think y'all know that this year, but I just kind of wanted to review some specific things about this. Now, when we talk about reflections, remember that the rules said reflect over x, change the y, reflect over y, change the x, okay? So what I want to kind of just show you is why that is. So if this is your x-axis, and this is, you can go ahead and make this on your, I guess I should go ahead and continue on this so that it all makes the same place, like you've only got one graph too. Okay, if this is the x-axis, remember that in here, anywhere you place a point, it is a coordinate point. And of course, x always comes before y. And in the first quadrant, you have a positive x and a positive y. Okay, your values are always positive. In the second quadrant, your x is always negative and your y is still positive. Okay, so anywhere in here your x value would be negative and your y value would be positive. Third quadrant, your x value is still negative, but what changes is your y value changes to negative. And in the fourth quadrant, your x's are positive, so you have positive x's, and negative y's. Okay, so positive x's and negative y's. Now, why this rule works for reflections, okay? If I'm in either one of these quadrants and I reflect over the x-axis, so over the x changes the value of the y. Do you see how it went from positive to negative here? It went from positive to negative here. And if I go the opposite way and start in either of these two quadrants and flip or reflect over the x-axis, then the negative y's turn to positive y's. So that rule, reflect over the x-axis, remember we said change the sign of y. So, and how we show that in a rule is every x and y coordinate of that figure, every point on that figure, every x and y coordinate pair, you change them by leaving the x the same, and now instead of being negative, it's change the sign of the y. So this now becomes not a negative sign, it becomes change the sign. So if when you remember, when your y was positive, then you're going to make it a negative. When it's negative, you're going to make it positive. But you don't put the positive sign in. You just write it as this. This is the general rule. It means reflect over the x, you change the sign of y. And you can see that that's what happens. Here it goes from a negative to a positive, but the x is still negative and the x is negative here. Here it goes from a negative to a positive, and the x is positive, the x is positive. So it's leave the x alone, leave the sign on the x alone, change the sign on the y. Okay? Now, let's look at what happens when we reflect over the y-axis. Well, let's write our rule first. Reflect over the y-axis, change the sign of x. Okay? So when we reflect over the y-axis, we change the sign of x. So now let's write the general rule. For every x and y coordinate pair, your arrow means you're going to change that coordinate pair by changing the sign of x and leaving the sign on y the same. So remember, this does not mean negative, it means change the sign. So for reflections, and actually rotations are coming the same way, on reflections and rotations, it means this sign now means change the sign. Okay? And this is just a little reminder. So if I go over the y, here it had a negative x, all of a sudden now I have a positive x. The y's stay the same. Here I ended up with a negative x, and now I ended up with a positive x going over to here, because when I reflect this way, I end up over here. So the y's stay the same, they're both negative still. Okay, so if you notice, if I start over here, I start with a positive y. If I reflect in a positive x, if I reflect over the y-axis, I end up with a negative x and a positive y. Okay, so after you have done this, you should have a practice in your hand also. And if you follow your notes, or you follow your notes, it should follow that practice very carefully. Just remember, it's change the sign. That's what it is. Reflect over x, change the sign on y. Reflect over y, change the sign on the x. And have a great day.